Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into some pretty high-stakes stuff from the UN General Assembly, the 80th session back in September 2025.
That's right. We've got source material focusing on President Donald Trump's appearance there.
And it covers two massive areas. The whole NATO-Russia dynamic, which is always tense, and also his, let's say, sharp critique of the UN itself, especially on migration.
Yeah, it was quite the moment in New York. You had geopolitics clashing right up against domestic concerns. So our mission today really is to unpack what was said.
Go beyond the headlines, right?
Exactly. For you, the listener, to understand the nuances. We're looking for those specific bits of information that really shape the policy debates going forward.
Okay, so let's start with what probably caused the biggest immediate stir. The president was in New York for the UNGA, September 23rd specifically, but the real bombshell dropped during a bilateral meeting.
Yeah, it was with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The atmosphere was already pretty charged, given the context.
Understandably.
But then a reporter asked a question that it shifted everything. Moved the goalposts from deterrence theory way over towards potential military action. Instantly.
And that's the quote we need to focus on first, I think. The reporter asked, "Do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?"
And you'd normally expect, some diplomatic hedging, maybe qualifiers.
Right, something cautious.
But the answer was just incredibly blunt, short, definitive. He just said, "Yes, I do."
Wow, just like that.
Just like that. And that single phrase, "Yes, I do," it immediately set this tone of escalation, redefined the threshold for what a response might look like.
Okay, so let's unpack that NATO stance. "Yes, I do," said right there next to President Zelenskyy. That feels hugely significant, maybe the biggest foreign policy line of the day.
Arguably, yes. Because it's not just talk. It suggests an immediate, kinetic response, like real-world action for violations.
How big a shift is that, though? Historically, NATO countries scramble jets all the time when Russian planes get close, right?
Yeah.
What's the actual difference between scrambling and a shoot-down order?
Oh, it's a massive change. And this is where the details really matter for understanding the policy. NATO's standard procedure, the SOP for unauthorized airspace entries, involves scrambling fighters. It's called Quick Reaction Alert, or QRA.
Okay.
These QRA jets, they shadow the aircraft, they issue warnings over the radio, maybe visual signals, they gather intel, ID the plane, and basically escort it out. The whole point is de-escalation while still showing, hey, this is our airspace.
So the aim is always to avoid actually starting a fight.
Precisely. Always. So
Right.
calling for a shoot down that treats an airspace violation, even one that might be, accidental, or a pilot testing responses, or just a transponder failure, as an active military attack requiring lethal force.
That sounds like a fundamental shift.
It absolutely is. From asserting sovereignty by being present to enforcing it with, destruction.
That seems to introduce a huge risk of miscalculation. The sources link this to a peace through strength idea. But how does that square with potentially sparking a much wider conflict?
Well, the peace through strength argument, at least as proponents frame it, is that showing restraint is seen as weakness. And weakness invites more provocation, more testing of boundaries.
So the idea is be tough up front to prevent worse later.
Kind of. By saying, yes, I do so directly, the signal being sent is NATO borders are absolute, non-negotiable. And the price for testing them is immediate, potentially the destruction of the plane.
But wait, NATO's an alliance, right, 32 countries. Doesn't a statement like that sort of bypass the whole political decision-making process within NATO? A shoot-down feels like something needing consensus, maybe even touching on Article 5 seriousness.
That's a really important point. It definitely raises huge questions for individual NATO members, especially those right on the border with Russia. Poland, the Baltic states.
Yeah, they're right there.
Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, technically only triggers if a member is attacked. But this statement suggests the U.S. position is that the threshold for using lethal force should be much, much lower than traditionally accepted.
So it puts pressure on those frontline allies.
Tremendous pressure. It forces leaders in those countries to rethink their own rules of engagement almost overnight. It turns what was already a dangerous game of diplomatic chess into a military standoff with a much, much shorter fuse.
Okay, so the key takeaway here isn't just the tough talk. It's the potential shift in the actual military playbook, demanding direct enforcement, not just political signals, for even a temporary border crossing.
Exactly. A potential move from intercept and escort to intercept and destroy.
And that sort of confrontational style wasn't just limited to NATO and Russia, was it? It carried right over into his broader address at the UN General Assembly.
Yeah, the transition was pretty seamless. That same energy, that same willingness to challenge was directed squarely at the UN itself.
Right. After the bilateral meeting, he took the podium at the UNGA and really rebuked the world leaders there, not just about one conflict, but about the whole institution.
He launched this fundamental critique, basically arguing the UN wasn't helping his administration's peace efforts and was, in fact, failing its core mission. It was broad, but the underlying message was deep distrust of the institution.
And the main charge, which I find fascinating, sort of flips the script on the UN's purpose. He argued, and I'm pulling from the sources here, that the UN too often is actually creating new problems for us to solve.
Not just failing to solve them, but creating them.
Exactly. That's way beyond saying it's ineffective. It's arguing it's actively making things worse, counterproductive.
And that really questions the whole relevance of the body, doesn't it? If a major power sees a global institution not as a problem solver, but as a source of instability, well, that justifies a big shift as how you engage with it, how you fund it. It challenges the UN's very reason for being from that perspective.
Yet, interestingly, despite that really harsh criticism, the sources also note he offered the hand of American leadership and friendship to the countries there. How does that fit? Criticize heavily, but then offer friendship.
It suggests a kind of conditional engagement, maybe. It signals we're willing to lead, we're willing to work together, but
But only on our terms.
pretty much only if the UN aligns with American goals or perhaps undergoes the kind of reform the administration wants. It's not pulling out completely, but it's definitely a demand for change, with the implied threat of scaling back cooperation if that change doesn't happen.
Okay, so identify failure, demand reform, keep the door slightly open. That sounds like a diplomatic strategy, albeit a forceful one. But the most specific example he gave of the UN creating problems wasn't about, say, peacekeeping failures or geopolitical deadlock.
Right.
It hit much closer to home.
Exactly right. The sources make it clear there was a sharp pivot. He shifted focus to what he called the #1 political issue, the crisis of uncontrolled migration.
And this is where the UN critique became really pointed, tied directly to U.S. domestic politics.
Yes, and the language got incredibly strong. Accusing the UN of, and this is another quote, funding an assault on Western countries and their borders. That's powerful framing.
Funding an assault. That paints a picture of active hostility, not just mismanagement.
It does. And to back that up, the administration offered very specific, very material claims about what the UN was supposedly doing, claiming the UN is supporting people that are illegally coming into the United States.
And what were the specific examples? Because those details are what really stick, right?
The sources mention claims that the UN provided things like food, shelter, transportation, and debit cards to illegal aliens.
Debit cards.
Yeah, citing debit cards is rhetorically very potent. It links the international body directly to funding actual money for an activity the administration labels an invasion.
Right. It makes the argument much more concrete, more visceral than just saying support. It implies direct financial complicity in border violations and gives a clear target.
Which leads right into the core contradiction the president laid out. The UN is supposed to stop invasions, not create them, and not finance them.
By defining uncontrolled migration as an invasion.
Then any UN action perceived as facilitating it becomes, in that framing, active support for a hostile act against a sovereign nation. Not just poor policy, but something much worse.
And he didn't just focus on the U.S. border, did he? The sources say he mentioned Europe, too.
That's right. He broadened it out, saying illegal immigrants are pouring into Europe and claiming those countries are going to hell because their leaders are supposedly too politically correct to act decisively.
So framing it as a global Western problem caused by weak leadership.
Exactly, a failure of political will across the West. But then, right after that criticism, he pivoted again, this time to claim success in the U.S.
And how did he back that up? What was the evidence offered?
He basically stated that after his administration took bold action to swiftly shut down uncontrolled migration, specifically mentioning detention and deportation, the flow stopped. He claimed migrants simply stopped coming. They're not coming anymore.
So presenting strict enforcement, detaining, deporting is the only thing that works. The deterrent.
That was the clear message. Enforcement equals results. And one final detail from the sources really underscores that enforcement focus.
What was that?
He specifically thanked El Salvador, publicly thanked them for receiving and jailing criminals that had entered the United States.
Wow. So, highlighting cooperation with other countries, specifically for detention and removal of people deemed criminals, that really emphasizes the hardline enforcement aspect.
Okay, so if we try to pull these threads together, synthesize the main themes from that really pivotal September 23rd appearance, you basically see three interconnected pillars emerging.
Right, what are they?
First, there's that dramatic lowering of the threshold for military action, the willingness to say, yes, I do, to shooting down jets violating NATO airspace. Real escalation potential.
Okay, pillar one, military escalation readiness.
Pillar two, a deep, fundamental distrust of the United Nations as an institution, not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive, creating problems instead of solving them.
Got it. Pillar two, UN critique, seeing it as part of the problem.
And pillar three, framing uncontrolled migration not just as a policy issue, but as an existential threat, an invasion, and crucially alleging that this invasion is actively supported financially and materially by international bodies. Think food, shelter, and those politically charged debit cards.
Debit cards again, it always comes back to the specifics. So this deep dive really shows how these things were linked, doesn't it? The tough talk on NATO jets wasn't separate from the UN bashing or the border focus.
Not at all. They were woven together tightly. It was a comprehensive statement of doctrine, really, emphasizing national strength, border control, both physical military control and control over institutional influences like the UN. This UNGA appearance laid out a very clear worldview.
It certainly did, a challenging stance on multiple fronts.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. We've looked at two pretty extreme demands from this one appearance. On one side, you have the call for immediate, violent military action, shoot down the jets to protect airspace.
Maximum physical force.
Right. And on the other side, you have this detailed critique aimed at stopping institutional financial support for migration, cut off the funding, stop the debit cards.
Institutional and financial pressure.
Exactly. So what does putting those two things side by side suggest about the administration's real balance of priorities? Is the main fight against the immediate, tangible military threat the jet in the sky? Or is the bigger, perhaps more central, fight against the institutional and financial structures, the UN funding, the debit card that are perceived to be enabling instability at the border, the jet versus the debit card? Which one represents the core challenge according to this doctrine?
That's a really interesting juxtaposition. The direct military versus the systemic financial.
Yep.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into that intense day at the UN General Assembly.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.